So I'm from NYSE Euronext. My focus for most of the last year has been around LIBOR, following the developments that Ola mentioned with the weekly report coming out in September of last year. And then the process that Baroness Hogg led towards the identification of a new administrator for LIBOR. And so that has been what I've been doing, and I'm now in the process of building that along with colleagues at NYSE Euronext, and we're looking forward to, well, I mean, that's not quite the word I should be using, but we're planning to go live with that service in the early part of next year. So I think it's opportune to talk today, and I'll give you the perspective of someone who is shortly to be an administrator of perhaps the most tarnished benchmark, but at least a benchmark which has the advantage of being in a regulatory jurisdiction in the UK, where the authorities have been very quick to move and to implement, as earlier explained, new legislation. So we're working within a very defined framework, which we're comfortable with. And many of the questions that we've been discussing today in terms of the European proposals, the IOSCO principles, have already been addressed in the UK framework. And it's worth noting that actually some of the ways the UK has implemented its approach diverges from what the Commission is proposing and what IOSCO is thinking. So those will need to be resolved from the perspective of administrators, but I think importantly from the perspective of submitters. Because the submitters to LIBOR are submitters to Euribor in many cases and to other benchmarks around the world. And as Kay Swinburne said at the very beginning, a global approach is most definitely needed here, because these benchmarks do not operate on a national basis or even a regional basis in terms of benchmarks such as LIBOR, for example. So I'll talk about the Euro perspective and focus as much as I can on transparency and governance in the interest of sticking to the topics of this panel. The Euro business will be a new business. The NYSE Euronext Rate Administration, I shouldn't use an acronym too freely, will be a new business designed purely to look after, to administer LIBOR. And in that context, we're comfortable with the majority of the proposals that the Commission has put forward. We think that the onus placed on administrators makes sense. Administrators, if you like, own or look after the benchmark, and they need to adhere to the principles, particularly of transparency and governance, in order to assure the users of those benchmarks that the benchmarks can be trusted, and in the case of LIBOR, that integrity can be returned. It's important to say that we as the administrator will not be the only ones doing that. We see the work as a partnership between the administrator, the submitters, and indeed also the competent authority or the regulator. We alone cannot return integrity to benchmarks. We require the submitters to be in partnership with us. And indeed, the submitters to LIBOR have made a great deal of progress since the issues we've all become aware of came to light last year. The UK reforms had been taken extremely seriously by the submitters to LIBOR. They have spent a considerable amount of money, developed technologies, processes, and oversight themselves in order to be part of that process, returning integrity to LIBOR. And it's important to note that as one thinks about one of the issues where the UK approach and the Commission diverge, which is whether contributors should be subject to the oversight purely of the administrator through a formal code of conduct, or subject to regulation from the competent authority, as is the case in the UK today. We see there being, in effect, a triangle: administrator, submitters, and competent authority, who need to work together. And at the moment, the different approaches taken by the UK, Europe, and indeed thinking about IOSCO principles are not quite in line, and that needs to be resolved, I think, going forward, because of the global nature of these benchmarks. So to talk about what we as the administrator will do, we succeeded in winning the tender process for LIBOR, we believe, because we brought two strong elements which are both essential to administering a benchmark. The first is strong regulatory experience. NYSE Euronext is an operator of markets globally. Primarily, that's what we do. We do other things, but we have considerable experience in operating markets around the world, including in the UK, where LIBOR will be administered. We also have significant experience with market-leading technology. And we're working ourselves, but also with a partner, rate validation services, in order to bring such technology to bear in the administration of LIBOR. So one needs, as an administrator, to be able to take in the submissions, in this case they're quotes, if you like, from benchmark submitters, and to be able to understand and to oversee, to check those in order to produce a reliable and robust benchmark. So we bring the regulatory side and the technology in order to do that, and we think that's why we were successful in our tender application. In terms of what we'll do in governance and transparency, we see that integrity needs to be returned, but it needs to be seen to be returned. So transparency in particular is extremely important here. So we believe that it's right and proper that every aspect of a benchmark should be made clear and transparent. The design of the benchmark, the methodology, the business continuity arrangements, who the submitters are, what the requirements placed upon them are, the oversight approach, what the administrator does to ensure compliance with its benchmark. All of those principles should be made clear so that users of the benchmark, or potential users, can decide whether the benchmark is appropriate for them. And it's certainly been highlighted in the case of LIBOR that there were perhaps many users who did not fully understand the nature of the benchmark and for whom perhaps LIBOR wasn't the most appropriate reference point. Now, we're comfortable that LIBOR isn't used as broadly as perhaps it was historically used, but we also want to make sure that those who have an interest in using it understand exactly what it is, how it's put together, and why they should or should not use it. Now, transparency does not mean homogeneity in terms of all of those points I've just raised. Different benchmarks will have different approaches, and different types of information will be appropriate to disclose there. And many of the other panelists so far today have made very clear why it's not appropriate to treat an equity index in the same way as a benchmark such as LIBOR, for example. With NYSE Euronext, we fully support that view. And in the pack that you've got today, there's a short paper explaining our view of the different types of benchmark, ranging from those based upon quotes in the loosest sense through to transactions from organized exchanges and other regulated entities. And we think those are 2 points on a spectrum that should be treated differently in the forthcoming regulation. But in terms of quotes, there are some who suggested that those really are not worthy to be relied upon for benchmarks. I would strongly disagree with that. I think that although there have been issues with the submission of quotes, and there's a very clearly documented, and perhaps there is more to come out, whether about LIBOR or about other benchmarks, a process can be put in place both at the submitter and at the administrator to ensure that the benchmark can use such quotes and that benchmark can be relied upon. And that's exactly what we as the administrator intend to do by working closely with submitters and implementing a surveillance approach that will, alongside what submitters are doing, ensure that the benchmark can be relied upon. Now, transparency also does not mean a full and immediate disclosure of all of the data. A benchmark is a synthesis of information, and as such, it's not necessary that every input is fully disclosed at the time of publication of the benchmark, provided that the methodology for calculating the benchmark and the source of inputs are disclosed. And that is certainly the approach that we take with LIBOR. We will publish the individual submissions, albeit Martin Wheatley led on this and made it very clear it makes more sense to publish them with some delay, in this case 3 months, because of some of the issues that arise if you publish individual bank submissions about the rate at which they can borrow, actually in real time or near real time. Now, turning to governance, we think it's appropriate that the administrator should have strong governance arrangements. Now, one issue that I think has been raised everywhere is conflicts of interest, how those should be addressed. I won't run through the different ways of doing that, but clearly an administrator must address those issues. And for an exchange group such as ourselves, we think that's perfectly doable. We are separating the administration business from the operation of the markets. Indeed, we don't see a particular conflict between the operation of the market, since we take no position in any product reference to LIBOR. We merely operate that market, but still we're separating to ensure there's no perception of a conflict of interest. Now, we're also putting in place pretty strong arrangements based upon the UK requirements, but which certainly echo what's in the IOSCO principles in terms of an oversight committee with balanced representation that will include submitters, but it's not dominated or controlled by submitters. It's going to include users and representatives of users, and it'll include independent experts. So that kind of composition we think is the right approach to ensuring appropriate governance of benchmarks. We will also have specific fora for benchmark submitters because it's important that we work with them to ensure that submission is the least onerous that it needs to be, if I can put it that way. Because clearly submission is something that, well, Euribor has certainly seen is perhaps increasingly difficult given the level of scrutiny and regulation. Now, in terms of the use of benchmarks, I said earlier, we don't think that it's appropriate for the administrators to specify who should use the benchmarks. Merely, we make it absolutely clear how the benchmarks are put together, the governance and transparency arrangements, and therefore the administrator has discharged its duty in that regard, and users can choose. Now, there is a question, of course, I raised a little earlier about whether submitters should be regulated by the competent authority. The UK has taken that approach. The Commission, IOSCO, I think, takes an approach which is more focused on a contract under the Code of Conduct between the administrator and submitters. Now that, I think, raises issues which need debate here and elsewhere in order to find an approach which works on a global basis. And on that note, I'll close. Thank you.